It's a beautiful night for bourbon. It's always a beautiful night for bourbon. And it's especially a beautiful night for bourbon when, well, do I have to say it? I've got bourbon. Yeah, you know me. If you've watched this channel at all, you'll know it's always a beautiful night for bourbon. Well, tonight, I'm going to talk about something that came up a couple days ago in the comments on Bourbon of the Week. Chris did a review of Knob Creek 12-year, in which he compared it to the 9-year. And the 9-year did not come out very favorably. Well, that led to a discussion in the comments where he replied to me that the 9-year was the perfect bourbon, but there was nothing special about it. Now, Charlie from Multicasking chimed in, and I sort of started thinking about what is the perfect bourbon? What qualifies as a perfect bourbon? Well, that's the subject of tonight's video. So, in honor of Chris, it's time for the traditional sip. Ooh. Yeah, I'll let you know what I'm drinking at the end of the video. You are really going to want to watch this because it's not what I thought it was. Now, before we get on to the list, let's talk about what makes a bourbon a perfect bourbon, because I think that's the debatable part of this video, or at least part of the debate anyways. For me, when I think about the perfect bourbon, there's really only one thing to consider. And that is, if I looked in the dictionary and found a picture of a bottle under the definition for bourbon, what bottle would it be? I think that breaks down into 3 parts: availability, value, and experience. So let's take those 3 parts one at a time. Availability. It really doesn't matter how good a bourbon is, what it tastes like, or anything else if you can't get your hands on it. Now, that's not to say that allocated and limited release bottles aren't great bourbons, but if you can't get them, it doesn't matter. And by you can't get them, I mean if you can't get them regularly, if they're like here for a few months and then they're gone forever. That's not a perfect bourbon. It might be a perfectly good bourbon, but it is not necessarily a perfect bourbon. Value. So far in my bourbon drinking journey, I have never paid more than $69.99 plus tax for a bottle of bourbon. I've got about a half a dozen bottles on my shelf that I've paid that for, but I've never paid more. It's not that I won't ever pay more. I'm pretty sure I will at some point decide to raise the limit, and it's really not even a hard limit. I never really decided on it. It's just the way it's kind of worked out. But I've never felt the need for it. I've heard a lot of people talk about the point of diminishing returns. That's the point where you start spending more and more money and getting less and less improvement. When that happens, you can no longer claim that your bourbon is a perfect bourbon. You can get great value out of your dollar with a lot of cheaper bourbons. And you can get little value for your dollar, for your daughter. You can get little value for your dollar with many expensive ones. So the perfect bourbon really needs to be a good value. Then, of course, there's the experience itself. The bottle, the cork pop, pour, the color, the aroma, flavor, finish, etc. Now, I don't put a whole lot of stock in the bottle, the cork pop, or the pour, but all those things do add a little bit to the experience. I never see a whole lot of difference in color. Some are lighter than others, but not by very much. Clarity isn't really an issue. So what matters most to me? The aroma and the flavor. And, well, of course, the finish. So let's talk about those things. That's where I've put the most thought where the perfect bourbon is concerned. At first, I had a really hard time with Chris's statement that Knob Creek 9-year was the perfect bourbon, but there was nothing special about it. But I've reconsidered that position, and I've really come to the conclusion that that's exactly what makes a bourbon perfect. The perfect bourbon should be exactly what you expect from a bourbon and nothing more. So that leads me down to, what do I expect from a bourbon? Well, I expect big, bold aromas, big, bold flavors. But not just any aroma or flavor. They need to be the traditional aromas and flavor that define the category. Vanilla, caramel, corn, a slight fruitiness like apples or pears or darker fruits like cherries or berries. Cinnamon and other baking spices. Oak, but not too oaky, not too dry. Sweet, but not overly sweet. There should be some heat to it. It needs to have a little bit of a bite, but it shouldn't be harsh. But it damn sure better not be smooth. It should have a very simple complexity. And I know that sounds kind of stupid, but think about it for a minute. These bourbons are complex. They have different characteristics, several different flavors popping up, several different aromas, which makes them complex. But it does not mean they aren't simple in that complexity. There's not a whole lot of other stuff going on. It should have a moderate to long finish. A few sips should give you a really nice Kentucky hug. And basically, that's how I picked my list. Because of the way I picked the list, there's a lot of very good bourbons that simply are not going to even be considered for this list. Finished bourbons. While many finished bourbons can be very, very good, I have a hard time calling them bourbon, because bourbon means that there should not be anything added to the product that changes the color, the aroma, or the flavor of that product. It's right in the law. But when you finish a bourbon, you are adding something that changes the color, the aroma, and or the flavor of that product. So I'm not even sure that those are really bourbons. I find it a lot easier to consider Jack Daniel's a bourbon than finished bourbon. And that's because Jack Daniel's actually does meet the legal criteria for a bourbon. Now I know, a lot of people don't consider Jack Daniel's to be a bourbon. And I won't call Jack Daniel's a bourbon. But the Lincoln County process, which is what everybody objects to, takes out stuff. It doesn't add to anything. And there's nothing in the law regarding bourbon that says you can't filter your bourbon. So calling Jack Daniel's a bourbon is a whole lot easier than calling a finished bourbon a bourbon. But Jack Daniel's doesn't consider themselves a bourbon, and as a result, I don't consider them one either. They're a Tennessee whiskey. So Jack Daniel's won't be on this list. Another thing you're not going to find on my list, wheated bourbon. I do enjoy a good wheated bourbon, but I don't think that this category actually defines bourbon. If I look up bourbon in the dictionary, I really don't want to find a wheated bourbon there. And what that means is that some of my favorite bourbons aren't going to make this list. Sorry, makers. Sorry, Weller. Just not going to happen. You're good drinks, you're good bourbons, and yes, I do consider wheated bourbons bourbons, but they're not something that defines bourbon for me. What you will find is bourbons that I think actually define the category. You could put a picture of the bottle in the dictionary and nothing else, and know what bourbon is all about. You will know what it is just from putting a picture of the bottle there. Those are the 5 bottles that you're going to find on my list. They have everything that's expected in a bourbon and very little else. They're the bourbons that have nothing special because they're so good they don't need to have anything special. So let's get to it. This list is not going to be presented in any particular order, except it'll be the reverse order from the way I picked them. I'll start with the last one that I chose for the list and work up towards the first one that I chose for the list. Number 5, Old Forester Signature 100. This one might be the most difficult to find on the list. There's one other one that can sometimes be a little tough, but I see that one more than I see this one, at least over the past year. It's $20.99 here in Ohio for a 750 milliliter, so that pretty much makes it an excellent value. It is an excellent drinking experience. The aroma and the palate have all the necessary aromas and flavors. They're sweet, they're vanilla, caramel, baking spices. It brings a little bit of heat. There's a sort of an apple and cherry pie thing to it. It's got a medium finish, a few sips in and you get a little bit of a Kentucky hug. I mean, pretty much everything is there. So let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is going to be Wild Turkey Rare Breed. I don't currently have a bottle of this on my bar, but I really do need to get one because it's one of these bourbons that I really don't like to be without. A couple of months ago, I blinded 5 wild turkeys. And Wild Turkey Rare Breed came in 3rd on my list. It wasn't my favorite. I'm finding that it is really a more typical bourbon than either the Russell's Single Barrel or the Russell's 10-year, which beat it out. So even though it wasn't my favorite wild turkey, it's one of the ones that I put on this list because it most typifies what I think a bourbon ought to be. It has all those aromas, all those flavors that I want in a bourbon. It's got an excellent mouthfeel, a nice long finish. It sells for $43.99 here in Ohio. It's on pretty much every shelf all the time. It's really hard to beat. But there's another wild turkey product that I think is even a more perfect bourbon. And that's the 3rd one that I put on my list, and that is Wild Turkey 101. I'm not going to say much more about it here because everything that I can say about Wild Turkey Rare Breed certainly applies to Wild Turkey 101. The 101 finished 4th on my list of wild turkeys. It's a little bit lower proof, so it's a little bit easier to drink, but it still drinks like a high rye bourbon, even though the rye content is only 13% of the mash bill. It's $23.99. That makes it just about half price for the Wild Turkey Rare Breed, so I think it's an even better value. And so Wild Turkey 101 makes my list, so Wild Turkey gets 2 perfect scores. The next one is the bourbon that got all this started, but it's a little bit different iteration of that bourbon. The Knob Creek 9-year 120 proof. Now I like this one a lot better than I like the 9-year 100 proof, but I can say pretty much the same things about the 100 proof that I'm going to say about this one. It's just that this one comes in at a higher proof, and I think doesn't drink that way. More drinkability. To me, that's a win-win. So it's not the same bourbon that Chris called the perfect bourbon, but like I said, I think this one is even more perfect. It hits all the right chords. It has the higher proof, and that makes it better. And at $49.99 for a 9-year bourbon at 120 proof, that's hard to believe. You couldn't be a better value than that, except for the next one. It's also a bourbon that I see on the shelf quite often. Not every time I go to every liquor store, But if I were to make a run around over the period of a week to my 6 favorite liquor stores, I'm probably going to see it on the shelf in at least 1 or 2 of them. So it's pretty much available all the time. You might have to hunt a little bit for it, which is kind of like the Old Forester signature. You might have to look around a little bit for it, but it shouldn't be too difficult to find. And that brings us to the top of the list. If you know me, you probably know what this is. Old Grandad 114. What can I say about this that I haven't said a million times already? I've been drinking this bourbon for 40 years. More than 40 years, actually. And it's the bourbon that, for me, defines bourbon. If I could put a picture of the bottle under the entry of bourbon and nothing else, you'd know exactly what defines bourbon. Because it hits all the right notes. It doesn't really have a whole lot else to it. But that doesn't mean it's not complex. That doesn't mean it's not good. I think it's excellent. If I had to pay for one bourbon and was limited to only one bourbon for the rest of my life, it would be Old Grandad 114. It's $29.99. I think it's the best value in bourbon, and it's almost always on the shelf. So, what's in my glass tonight? It's not one of these perfect bourbons. In fact, it isn't even a bourbon. I currently don't have a bottle of OGD 114 on my bar. It's one of the rare times that I don't have one. So I reached for what I thought was the Knob Creek 9-year. Popped the cork, poured a glass without really paying any attention to what I was doing. And just as I sat down to make this video, I took a sip. Oh boy. It was absolutely not what I expected. It was different in almost every way possible. I went back to the bar, I took a look, and I had to start laughing. I mean, boy, it was a stupid mistake. Same bottle, different whiskey. Knob Creek, cask strength, rye. I really dig this stuff. It's really good. But if you're not expecting a cask strength rye at 127 proof, it practically blew my head off. All right, if you've made it this far, here's the challenge. Define the perfect bourbon. Pick 5 bourbons that best meet your definition. And of course, Chris over at Bourbon of the Week and Charlie over at Multicasking, I'm looking at the 2 of you. You got me started down this road, so I'm challenging you. But why not anybody? If you've got a bourbon channel, we all seem to love a good challenge as much as we love a good list. So here's to you. Let's see if this is one of those lists that can take off. If you like my videos, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. Thanks for watching, and y'all come back now. You hear? Oh! Whoa! What the hell am I drinking? Jesus Christ! Whew! That is not Knob Creek 9-year.